This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
Well, hello. Thanks again for being here, Bob and Dennis.
It's good to be here, Eric.
Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. I want to get into, and we're doing a little bit differently here for people that have listened regularly. I wanted to invite both these gentlemen on together because together I think, this is my interpretation, not theirs necessarily, that both Bob and Dennis combined probably have had more of an influence on the food system here in the United States and globally than many other combinations of people I can think of. They are some of the deepest experts I am aware of on food safety, food innovation, and how we've applied that to policy across this country over the last, let's say, 30 years at least. They're a wealth of knowledge, and I think most people don't ever get a chance to interact with people like Dr. Merker and Dr. Keefe here, who have directly had a hand in almost all the foods that you've touched and consumed in a grocery store in some way, shape, or form. And so today we wanted to just have a discussion around what it takes to sort of make food safe in this country and sort of the history of food innovation and regulation, especially with all the news around some of that we'll talk about, the updates to the system and the innovation that is occurring in the private sector and then the political climate that we find ourselves in. So with that said, I think it's particularly interesting that you both have worked to modernize how FDA has regulated foods in many novel ways. But both of you are scientists first and foremost. So let's start there. Let's start, Dennis, with you. What led you both to a career at FDA in the first place as a scientist, and then ultimately, like, what kept you there?
Okay, I'll go first. Thanks, Eric. For me, I started working at FDA back in the early 90s, and what brought me to FDA was at the time an interest in how the agency was going to oversee the safety of the new genetically engineered foods from plants. My background is in plant science, and I was very curious, and I wanted to be involved with how they were going to be overseen going forward and how that technology would be regulated. So that's what brought me to the agency. And then I spent over 30 years there working on many, many different interesting projects, not just the biotech plant field, but also a number of rulemakings to fortify the food supply with folic acid. I worked on rulemaking to try to get prenatal iron supplements off in packaging that would prevent the pediatric poisoning deaths. I also spent quite a bit of time on developing international standards for food additives, working through the Codex Alimentarius. So it was a very interesting career for me and very, very stimulating. Lots of interesting scientific questions to address.
And Bob?
Well, actually, I started at FDA as a lab microbiologist. That my training was in microbiology, and I spent a few years doing research on food contamination. At one point, I worked on a food additive petition for UV irradiation of juices, and that was my entry into the world of food ingredients. And I found it so interesting that when the opportunity came, I went there, and I stayed there for about 20 years, ended up working as the person that ran the program on food from genetically engineered plants. So Dennis and I have a certain commonality.
So what attracted you both? Like, how did you both find out you could work at FDA? Like, I'm curious about how you even made the connection that you could turn a professional science career into a regulatory career. Maybe Bob, let's start with you.
For me, it was actually that I went to a job fair at a scientific meeting, and there were representatives from FDA there, and they were one of the groups of people that I talked to, and they convinced me that it would be an interesting thing to do, and so I did it.
I love that straightforward job fair. Dennis?
Well, me, I was looking after my postdocs. I was looking for positions and research and academic positions and also possibly industry positions. But then it occurred to me that after talking to some of the industry folks that it really wasn't clear how these things are going to be regulated, the genetically engineered plants. So I started reaching out to federal agencies. I went first to EPA, and because I thought, well, they're the ones that are going to be regulating this. And I soon found out that, well, actually they have a piece of it, but the real big player is going to be FDA. And so I came to FDA and reached out to FDA, and lo and behold, they were looking for someone with my background, and I got really lucky. I hit it at the right time. And went to a job fair, and under a unique hiring authority they could hire me right there on the spot. It's pretty quick.
So what I find interesting is that you both spent basically most of your careers, the meaty parts of your careers at FDA. So I want to dig into that just a little bit, because you've already used terms that I think many people are unfamiliar with. And like, for example, food additive petition will, unpack some of those things.
Mm-hmm.
To start with some of the government acronyms, Dennis, you were director of OFAS, Office of Food Additive Safety, which has a different name now. And I'll just call that Food Ingredient Safety.
Mm-hmm.
And you were responsible for the team that conducted these mandatory pre-market review of food additives, color additives, food contact substances. We'll talk about what those are. It also managed FDA's voluntary programs for generally recognized as safe, which people probably know as GRAS, substances and foods derived from new plant varieties, which were biotechnology notifications. So, and then also the use of recycled plastics in food packaging and foods derived from cultured animal cells, which is how we interacted when I was in the private sector. And Bob, you led the team that oversaw basically all plant biotechnology products that came through FDA, or what I will just call the food innovation team. So one, I'd love if you both could unpack and just explain what some of those terms mean, and like just the general structure of how FDA regulates food. As a way of sort of dispelling a few common misconceptions about how food is regulated. For example, what types of food require mandatory pre-market review? Why do we even have that? And are there any foods that do not require review? So maybe Dennis, we start with you, and then Bob, please feel free to weigh in.
That's well, Eric. So first and foremost, FDA is a science-based organization. I mean, it's science-based from its very origins with Harvey Wiley back in the early days of the foods program. But in addition to the science, what FDA does is they integrate that science with the statute and what the law says. And the primary statutory amendment that deals with food additives was one that was passed in 1958, the Food Additives Amendment, and subsequent to that, there was the Color Additives Amendment. So as a result, under the U.S. system of food safety, there are statutory definitions of food additives and statutory definitions of a color additive. And if you fall into those definitions, you must go through a very formal rulemaking process where you're basically saying, FDA, may I use this in food under these conditions? And the statute establishes, a safety standard, a reasonable certainty of no harm under the intended conditions of use. It also establishes who has the burden of proof to establish safety. So if you fall into those definitions, you are subject to the Food Additive Authority. But there are some exceptions to the food additive definition. And in particular, there are things like pesticide residues who are intentionally added to food, but they're not food additives, they're pesticides. And there's residues of the pesticides in food, and EPA establishes those tolerances for pesticides. Similarly, there are residues of veterinary drugs in meat from applications, and those are excluded from the definition of a food additive. And the one that is most commonly in people's minds is the GRAS exclusion, or the generally recognized as safe exclusion. And this is a specific exclusion in the food additive definition. There is no GRAS exclusion in the color additive definition. So if you're a color additive, you must go through a pre-market approval. For To be grass requires, and this is by statute, 1958 statute, it's either by history of safe use prior to 1958 or based on scientific information that's publicly available and that qualified experts would agree that the use of the substance is safe. If you meet those criteria, you are then excluded from the requirement of the food additive approval process. All right. So whenever FDA gets a new technology, if you will, or the science advances, they go back and look at the act and say, okay, where does this fit into the Food Additive Authority and Color Additive Authority? Or does it apply to the general safety standard, which is another statutory definition of safety that's applied to food in general, which may render injurious? The burden of proof in that situation is on the FDA. So with any new technology, with the plant biotech technology, with the cell cultured meat technology, FDA looked at the science and then looked at it through the lens of the statute and what was the appropriate authority to apply here. And that's where you see the programs that FDA implements on the food additive side. Some of them are mandatory and some of them are voluntary, but that's a direct result of its statutory authority.
I think one interesting point is that if foods are being irradiated, the source of irradiation is actually defined as a food additive.
Right. That's one of those interesting,
I think that's
little caveats.
That's one interesting point. And I think another interesting point was that in 1992, FDA incorporated these concepts, and particularly the concept of grass, to develop its policy on genetically engineered plants. And basically in a policy document that they released in 1992, discussed the fact that because a lot of things that we eat contain DNA, that DNA in most cases is going to be grass.
So, Bob, sticking with this for a second, and Dennis, you brought up a lot of terms, and I think we should just take one step back. We all worked at FDA. I think we all kind of know this, but like you refer to the act, statute, rulemaking, regulations, and then we didn't talk about it, but guidances and what have you, and like food additive itself. Like, Bob, could you take us through how those connect and like what those all kind of mean in relation to each other as it applies to being a regulator? I think that's really important for people to understand as well.
I think in essence, Congress passed the two amendments that Dennis talked about. So those are actually laws. We call them amendments, but they are laws, and they did go into the effect, and they both provide FDA with tools for looking at food and color additives, but they also limit FDA's authority on food and color additives. What they also did was they set forth a review process that FDA needed to follow. And in that review process, much like other approvals that other parts of FDA go through, FDA actually reviews raw data that's provided to support the fact that the use of these food and color additives would be safe. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think for those listening, if in my dumb brain, I think of like the law sets what an agency can and cannot do. That's congressionally mandated, but it doesn't say how it can be achieved. Like, what are the specific steps that would need? Frankly, that usually requires a lot of specific expertise, like you both had. So that's where rulemaking and regulations come in, where that's an interpretation of that authority. And then from there can be suggestions, quote unquote, by the US government. And those are guidances that help companies and industries sort of form safety. But then, and then of course you get all of these little exceptions, for example, like a GRAS program or an additive petition. And for those listening too, I think it's important to note additives I like to think of them, again, very simplistically, as like an ingredient. That's not exactly one to one, but that's the easiest way, I think, because we don't really talk about ingredients at FDA as much.
It could be an ingredient, and it also could be something that is used in the production of food that comes in contact with food. So
Exactly, like packaging,
primarily.
right? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, Eric, what people don't realize that since the program first started back in the 60s, late 50s, most of the little beans that the FDA has looked at, the little widgets, the individual additives, have been food contact applications. That's been a large part of what the agency has done, and I think our consumers, my mother, my family, friends, they think of things that are added to their crackers or their yogurt or what as the scope of additives. But really, it's much broader than that in terms of the regulatory oversight. Much, much broader. And I would just, one other thing I wanted to say, Eric, before you jump in, the guidance, the plant biotech program and the cell cultured meat program are both voluntary programs and that allow industry to come to FDA and ask if there is any regulatory oversight that is needed in addition to the general safety standard. In other words, is there a food additive issue as part of this application of the technology that would require additional regulatory oversight and rulemaking?
Dennis, what if you had to estimate the ratio of food contact substances, or we'll just, again, shorthand for them, packaging, versus food additives direct food additives and ingredients? What would you say that was? It sounds like there was considerably more food contact notices than there were the additives.
Yeah, the food. I can't give you an exact number off the top of my head, but I'll give you an example in terms of the program when I was managing the office. We could do almost 100 food contact notifications a year. We might do on a max 60 to 70 GRAS notices a year. There would be maybe 4 to 5 plant biotech notifications. And then in terms of a food additive or a color additive regulations, there might be 3 or 4 a year. The additive, the petition process, the food additive and the color additive petition process is a much more burdensome administratively. Scientifically, it is not that different, assuming they have all the information. Once they have all the information, I want to just say that with the food contact notification program is a very specialized program in terms of its eligibility and the types of substances that by statute are eligible to go through the notification program. And that program also requires that once the notification is submitted by the industry to the agency must respond in 120 days to deny it. If they don't, then it automatically becomes effective. So there's a lot of efficiencies in that program to move the notifications through. It's a very busy program.
Yes.
One of the things,
other people. Oh, go ahead, Bob, please.
One of the things that I'd add to that is that the food contact notification program is the few that actually is a license given to a specific
Right.
organization, as opposed to the regulations that can be applicable to anybody that meets the specifications for a particular product.
Right.
Or a GRAS notice, which is also generally applicable as long as people meet the specifications and process.
Right.
And again, Bob, let's stick with you for a sec. Are there any foods that do not require review? Like how, are farmers required to get review for some of their products? Like, take me through. I think a lot of people don't realize, again, how does FDA actually do its job to keep food safe? Beyond just sort of approving these new food ingredients.
Certainly things that were in the food supply prior to 1958 don't and were safely used generally don't need FDA review because they do fit that criterion of having been used safely in the food supply prior to that date.
So things that we've just been eating typically for a long time, and by the way, I'm accepting for like animals like cows and chickens because those are actively regulated by USDA differently under different law, and do require active management. But like my onions, my celery that I'm growing.
I'd go a step further in that generally conventional plant breeding was not something that FDA took an active hand in regulating. There are a very few instances where there were some issues with conventionally bred crops.
Eric, could I jump in here? I think what you're asking is really about the general safety provisions in the Act for Food generally. What Bob and I, the program that Bob and I worked in was really focused on pre-market review of new ingredients. It wasn't reviewing the safety of new foods per se. So the safety of an onion or a sprout or romaine lettuce, all of that is under FDA's what we call post-market authority. The burden, the safety of the food is assumed, but there are responsibilities of the manufacturers, the processors, etc., to keep them safe. And there's record keeping requirements. There's in some cases there's requirements in terms of how like a dairy is operated, temperatures for pasteurization, etc. So that's a whole nother complex discussion for your audience. What we're focusing on here is the food ingredients, the things that are intentionally added to food or intentionally come in contact with food, and that was our bit of FDA. Most of the foods program at FDA is post-market. A little bit is market.
Very helpful, and I think you're right to
worth,
bring that up. Go ahead, Bob.
I think it's also worth pointing out that most of the safety issues with food are either microbial contamination or the having allergens present that haven't been appropriately labeled.
Yeah.
Related to this, gentlemen, I hear a lot from people sort of, and I think this is largely candidly due to our access to social media and news and a constantly connected society. But we're seeing quote unquote more and more food contamination or outbreaks. But I would counter that I think, and again, I don't have the data in front of me, that we actually are seeing over a gross trend over time of less issues of food pathogenic contamination, what have you. That our food processes, our food production system is actually safest it's ever been today, quite literally. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Bob, or would you say that? I'm sure there's a caveat to this that I'm missing.
I think that there have been issues that pop up every now and then. Certainly, these days, I'm seeing an awful lot of them on the USDA side. There have been a few on the FDA side, and certainly, the most well publicized one was the outbreak that happened in infant formula several years ago.
Mm-hmm. Eric, but I think our food supply is safe, is as safe as it ever was. I think it might be that with the development of the whole genome sequencing technology to detect microbes before and during outbreaks has really advanced our ability, the agency's ability to get ahead of a food contamination event and minimize the adverse outcomes. I think that's a really critical advancement, and that's a technology that was developed in-house at FDA, and has been used and has now gone globally to track food pathogens around the world and look for linkage and try to track down the origin of the contamination.
Speaking of that, because I think whole genome sequencing was an innovation that really changed how we do science fundamentally. But for both of you, like what were the key innovations that you saw that came across your desk in those 30 years that have really stuck with you historically, where you said either a company or a technology for testing, at FDA came up where you were like, wow, this really is gonna change how we eat in this country. Bob, maybe we start with you.
I think actually, having worked in plant biotech for several years, there were several interesting things that happened there. There were also some very interesting GRAS notices that came through. The first one that comes to my mind was actually something produced by a microorganism. It was the soy-like hemoglobin that was submitted by Impossible Foods, and I think that's probably one of the most novel applications that we saw, using a protein that was ordinarily produced in a plant, having yeast produce it, and then using it as a substance to impart a meatier flavor to plant-derived products. I thought that was pretty interesting. Probably the most helpful thing that I can remember was fairly early on in the GRAS program, the use of algal and fungal oils to make infant formula more like human milk. I think was a big step forward in the attempt to make infant formula a little bit more like human milk. And certainly we saw some interesting things come through the plant program. We saw pink pineapple. We saw recently purple tomatoes, and apples that don't brown as easily, potatoes that don't bruise as easily. So there have been a bunch of interesting things coming down the pike. Dennis?
Yeah. I think you've covered most of them, Bob. They're really clever. I think one of the other one was a polysaccharide coating that's used to coat fruits and vegetables to extend shelf life, and so they don't lose as much moisture. And it was really quite. I think Appeal was the company that did this. Actually, it was a startup that I think it got some Gates funding, but it was a really clever use of biotechnology to address a food security issue in terms of preventing the rotting of fruits, reducing the speed at which the fruits and vegetables spoiled.
Yes, Appeal. They used. They were in our cohort. I remember back in the early Upside days. They used the trimmings from vegetables and fruits, and then processed them into that coating. So they used food waste to prevent food waste, which I loved.
Yeah.
So clever. Again, given where we are in the country, we are in a new administration that has embraced this sort of, make America healthy again, this MAHA movement headed by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at HHS. And the recent removal of Red 3 from foods. And you were talking again about the infant formula debacle under the previous commissioner, Dr. Califf's. With MAHA trying to reevaluate our current food system, consumers demanding more transparency, how, from your perspective, has FDA historically responded to updated science and health knowledge? First off, let's start there, Dennis.
Well, I'll give you an example that while I was the office director, partially hydrogenated oils, which had been in the food supply for probably since after World War I, and really increased after World War II in terms of its use. And note the dates that I'm talking about here, the time frame I'm talking about, prior to 1958, when FDA had pre-market approval over ingredients. And then more recently, in the 90s, information became available that partially hydrogenated oils were connected to can cause coronary heart disease. And evidence is becoming stronger and stronger about this. And eventually, we did some rulemaking to explicitly say that, at this point, partially hydrogenated oils don't have a history of safe use in food. The scientific evidence doesn't support that at all, and that we do not consider that this use is grass in the food supply. And we went through a very formal process to announce this as a temporary decision and to the final decision. And then as a result, industry was required, if they wanted to use partially hydrogenated oils in the food supply, they had to go through the food additive petition process. And they tried that, but it wasn't successful. So the petition was denied. So here's a situation where increasing knowledge about an ingredient in the food supply is showing that the use of that specific ingredient is unsafe. And through the statutory authorities that FDA has, we went through all of the hoops and jumps to get it off the market. And we did get it off the market. So partially hydrogenated oils are no longer used in the U.S. food supply.
Bob, to follow up on that, why somebody might rightfully at least offer the criticism, I don't know that I agree with it, but they might say, hey, well, then why was it allowed on market at all? Like, why did FDA not know this sooner? I mean, can you speak a little bit to the thinking as to why products often, if they do get reevaluated and are pulled from the market, this wasn't caught sooner, potentially?
I think part of it is coming up with strong evidence, one way or another. Accumulating data on human health is not an easy thing. That all of us are genetically a little bit different, unless we're identical twins or something like that. And doing well controlled studies or even studies on what people eat and outcomes is really a very complex thing to try and do. And certainly not a lot of that work was being done prior to 1958 when the laws were passed. And as Dennis mentioned, these were ingredients that were used long before the food additive amendment was passed. So I think a lot of it is just really that, some of it is that science can at times, and particularly medical science, can be kind of slow to accumulate some of the data, and particularly because we eat a very varied diet. It is very hard to look at cause and effect, because you don't really have good controls on that kind of study. And as scientists, we really like controlled studies where we can narrow things down to a single variable. It is very hard to reduce what people eat to a single variable. Dennis, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, the studies that were used to support the action on PHOs were controlled feeding studies with humans. They were very controlled diet that removed the PHOs, but had a similar fat composition, and it had similar nutrient compositions. And people were they were basically locked up for 3 weeks to do these studies, and biomarkers were identified that linked, multiple biomarkers, I should say, linked to the causation of a coronary heart disease. So it was pretty clear that PHOs were causing coronary heart disease.
I always like to tell people that scientists have often sort of a Sisyphean choice when designing studies. One is, and I use the example of if I wanted to study an elephant and its behavior. One option is to put it into a controlled environment that I control the lighting, the food, the space, the colors, the temperature, all that stuff. And I monitor its behavior, what it eats, whatever, when it sleeps. However, the rightful criticism would be like, maybe its behavior is different because it's not in its natural environment and you're controlling things in a way that it doesn't like. The opposite is to go study it in its environment, right? To just watch it in the on the plains of Africa, what have you. But the problem then there is what you bring up, Bob, is like it's going to eat lots of different things. We can't control when it goes to sleep or what it does. So I think food and nutrition science often faces this same challenge, in that ethically we can't lock humans away and just feed them a single thing and find out what happens to them. So we have to rely on watching them in the wild, quote unquote. And that is a much messier picture, frankly.
Right. And I think, Eric, you're getting at a point that is really gets it in terms of making safety decisions about a new ingredient or a food ingredient. It really requires a diverse set of data. And there are different studies looking at different toxic endpoints. And it's the integration of all of that information to make a safety decision and determine, what is a safe level of exposure. So, all of the I guess my point is that the approvals of a new ingredient are not based on a single study. It's a collective evaluation of available science. And similarly, when sometimes there's a study comes out that suggests that substance X is problematic. Well, that new study has to be interpreted within the context of all the other information we have about that substance. And the FDA does have a wealth of information internally about the safety of substances that are in the food supply, in their files.
Would you both say this would also apply to something like Red 3? I'm particularly curious, not necessarily about how it got on market, but quote unquote why it took so long to get it off market in the United States when other countries sort of had removed it. It's sort of a unique story, I think, from my perspective. I'm curious what you gentlemen think.
So with Red 3, and I think if you look at the final rule on Red 3, FDA stated that they didn't have safety concerns with it, but they were removing it from the market because it's been shown to cause cancer in animals. And one of the clauses in the definition of the food additive and the color additive definitions is that a food additive can't be approved for use if it's been shown to cause cancer in man or animals. And so Red 3 was after it was first listed, the information became available that it was potentially a carcinogen, and there was I think it was a mouse studies where there was a type of cancer being formed that wasn't really related to human situation. The mechanism was not analogous. So FDA removed it as a result of a petition from outside group and base it on what's called the Delaney clause, the cancer causing clause of the act. And that was the basis for removing it. It wasn't removed before, I think, because of the complexity of the issues. And I know there was internal attempts before to try to remove it, but there were decisions to not follow that action for whatever reason. I think primarily because it wasn't a safety concern. It wasn't thought that we should be spending resources on something that was not a safety concern. We should be working on areas that were more important in terms of safety, more relevant, more acute, if you will. So it was a policy decision made within the agency, and I think at one time even within the department. But the petition that came in more recently, the color additive petition that came in more recently, force the agency to take action.
I recently had Helena Bonamiller-Evich, who broke the infant formula, a lot of that stuff first. I'm curious from that perspective, what do you think was happening at FDA that led to that really unfortunate outcome and sort of the subsequent reorganizations and restructurings that have occurred at FDA from y'all's perspective? Bob, maybe let's start with you, if you don't mind.
Well, I was no longer at the agency when any of that happened, so I'm going to defer to Dennis.
Yeah, and I retired a few months after that. So, but I'm not going to wash my hands here. I think what I find curious about that incident in terms of the outcome, and it was a terrible tragedy. But what happened, what the agency's response, and it was, and the hazard that was identified was a microbial hazard. This was a microbe that got into the infant formula through some sort of contamination, and and I don't know all the details of what how all of that, but it's interesting to me that as a result of that incident, the Human Foods Program was reorganized. And yes, there was some consolidation with and more control for the foods program over the field and the inspectors and what setting priorities. But also there was a renewed interest in chemical safety, food chemical safety, food additive safety, and which had nothing to do with the infant formula problem. And so, but there was a resurgence of interest in the food additives program coming out of that reorganization to the Human Foods Program and making it a priority, which I found really interesting.
I kind of add to that one of the things that the agency was attempting to do, and I guess is attempting to do subsequently, is try and put a little bit more effort on post-market evaluation of food ingredients. However, when the agency brought a request to increase staff to be able to do more of that to Congress didn't give them any additional resources.
Right. It's interesting, and we'll talk about this in a moment about how basically all FDA food commissioners have asked for more resources, not less, to handle the increase. And with this new request to reevaluate and eliminate self-affirmation of grass, it's going to further increase workload on the agency. So I do think it's fair game to offer criticism of federal agencies, especially ones that are science-based. We are scientists. We ply our trade in constructive criticism. With all that said, with the recent major structural changes at FDA, and the appointment of RFK Jr. and the resignation of the head of foods, Jim Jones, where do you think we are in terms of the future of FDA? I don't necessarily think it's a bad future or anything like that, but I'm curious, based off these recent changes, where do you think the agency is heading? Maybe Dennis, start with you.
Well, I for one welcome the new attention to the food chemicals space, although I certainly do understand. Well, while most of my career was focused, the emphasis of the agency in terms of safety was on the microbial and allergen cross contamination, or because the chemicals, the food additives, there really hasn't been anyone that has come of a substance that FDA has looked at and has approved or established safe conditions that has been shown to be causing any safety concerns. So the track record of the program, the food additives program, is pretty strong in terms of its safety decisions. I do think with the post-market surveillance program or post-market re-review, I think it's not a bad idea, but I would suggest that it's very important to do it in a way that's science-based and setting priorities, and not be focused on the substance of the day, because those post-market evaluations are resource intensive. And I think there's a way to use artificial intelligence based on what we know about toxicology of various chemicals to scan the substances and prioritize them for re-review. Also, I mean, some of the ones like the certified colors or the preservatives or whatever, those have been looked at by other countries. though they have been looked at by international standard setting organizations like FAO and WHO and their risk assessors. So a lot of it, we should be thinking about it and leveraging other resources and other evaluations to set priorities on what FDA does in terms of a post-market review, if you will, and do this on based on the science and not some additive of the day or substance of the day.
Bob, anything to add to that?
I think the one point that I would make, though, is that with respect to microbial safety versus the safety of chemicals and other substances that are used in food, is that on the microbial side, you can have people getting very sick and dying almost immediately, whereas with the food chemicals, often you need large amounts of chronic exposure to a particular substance. And because we eat a varied diet, or at least most of us do, the likelihood of some of those things happening, if there were an issue, is probably a lot lower.
I also think they're related to this, that there's legitimate criticisms of the GRAS program, but I also think there's significant evidence that it is an effective program as well. And I think a shining star on the global stage. But having worked on it for and that you both have had extensive experience in this. What do you both say about the concept that we can generally, quote unquote, recognize if food is safe? Like, looking back on the program and where it's going, I'm curious as to your sort of, what's your report card on it, if you will? Maybe Dennis, let's start with you.
Okay, I'll go ahead, Bob. So I think in terms of people coming to the agency and getting and doing their notification and putting their dossier together and getting FDA's opinion on their GRAS determination, that program has worked very well. But industry won't do that. They won't come to FDA if the program is not doesn't respond in a timely and predictable manner. They will make an independent determination. So it's kind of a catch-22 for the powers that be to fully resource that program so that it can be responsive in a timely and predictable manner. Because right now there's quite a bit of a backlog in GRAS notifications, and industry is saying, well, I can't make my business plans, I can't get to market in a timely manner when and waiting for FDA to respond. I'm going to go ahead. So it's self-defeating to under resource the GRAS program. Yes, there are players. There are people who will avoid going to FDA with the GRAS notice intentionally because they just don't want to be bothered. But the major food companies now, many of them are requiring that their suppliers provide evidence that the ingredient has gone through some sort of review by FDA. And I think there's ways to, especially with newer technologies, FDA could set up a program using the knowledge of the chemistry of the food additives, the chemically defined substances, to create maybe a certification program and an online thing where you provided the structure of the substance, and fed it into a database, and you could get this is similar to the GRAS notice that we've already looked at. Don't bother us. We certify that if you meet the regulation, the GRAS specs, you're okay to go to market. That could speed things up quite a bit, and it would also make the FDA's role more efficient in terms of its resources and more timely. So there's lots of improvements that can be done using technology at this point. There's a lot of opportunities here.
Bob?
I'd point out that there were actually more people evaluating GRAS notices back in the early 2000s, when we were only getting about 25 to 30 GRAS notices per year. than there are now, where they're getting 60 to 75 notices per year or more. So that team is being pushed to its limits. And I would say I think the program actually has been very effective. I'd also say that if you look at the grass inventory, which it is available online, and that new submissions, the existence of which are posted on a monthly basis, you can learn a lot about what's in the food supply, because eventually the entire notice gets posted. So I think some of the complaints about the GRASS program really aren't based on what the GRASS program has actually accomplished.
Right.
I think the program is a good one. I just don't think there are sufficient resources for it to work the way it was originally intended. And they've also had a lot of turnover in the past several years, and so they've got a lot of new people, and it takes time for new people at the agency to be trained.
Bob, let's stay with you for a second. I want to talk about the 1990s, because it's arguably the pivotal decade for foods in the United States. Many of the sort of subsequent foods and innovations that were made possible as a result of sweeping changes made at FDA at that time. So could you just briefly take me through like what happened at that point during that time, and what that meant for food production? And I'm curious specifically also about like what did the FDA scientists sort of accurately predict about the future at that point too, in anticipating what was coming down the pipe? Since you were basically leading that work, I'm curious what you saw.
I actually think the pivotal thing, which was done before I joined OFAS, was the 1992 plant policy, which really set forth a lot of principles that have been followed ever since. One thing to keep in mind was that back in the early 90s, both what are now the food contact notifications and food additive petitions were actually one thing. That what are now called the food contact substances were then indirect additives that had to go through food additive approval, which is a much longer process, and over time has picked up a lot of regulatory requirements like environmental review and other aspects. And so there was innovation in terms of the programs that went on in the 1990s. So initially, or one of the first things that happened was the plant biotech consultation program was developed based on that 1992 policy. Later on, Congress actually passed a law that allowed for the food contact notifications, which up until that point, the FDA had a very large backlog of food additive petitions. And at that point, a lot of people were actually recruited to help reduce the backlog. Dennis can probably speak to that better than I can. And then in 1997, the GRASS notice proposal went out. Prior to that point, there was a GRASS affirmation process whereby a company could ask that FDA affirm that the use of a substance was GRASS, and that was a very inefficient, I've heard it called dysfunctional program, and so the plan was to have a streamlined version whereby people could notify the agency that the use of a substance in food was GRASS. Dennis?
Yeah, I think you're right, Bob. I think that 92 policy, it sort of made people think anew about the food additives amendment and how it could be how it should be interpreted. And in particular, with the enormous backlog of petitions, GRASS petitions, food additive petitions, color additive petitions, there were congressional hearings on the program, and that led eventually to the statutory changes that created the food contact program. But it also brought resources into the program and new thinking into the program, and that's where the grass notification program got developed, and that culture was also the one that led to the approach with the cell cultured meat, and looking at the statute and the science, and is it appropriate to require a mandatory system here, kind of push every program through the food additive hole, or do we have a square peg that won't go through there and it won't stand up to scrutiny? I mean, the biotech program, we actually at one time, I think we published a proposal to make it mandatory, and it never reached it. It had to be withdrawn eventually because the statute didn't support it. So there, people have tried to push things through that food additive pre-market approval authority, but it doesn't always work, and it's not always a benefit to food safety.
Well, that leads to, I think another question that is, I'm curious, what common misconception do you both feel that you need to dispel about once and for all, sort of about FDA or its abilities or just how food is regulated in this country? I'm curious, like, what's the thing you constantly find yourself going, no, that's, this is reality, instead. Bob?
I think I'm going to defer to Dennis on that one.
I think I have two, Eric. I have one. The first is there is a misconception, and people have said that with the rulemaking that established the grass notification program was when grass became voluntary. The grass was always voluntary, dating back to 1958. The statute does not require anyone to come to FDA if the substance is generally recognized as safe. So, to make grass mandatory, you're going to have to go back and change the statute. All right. The other thing is that I would dispel is FDA has a lot of information about food chemicals. And most of these are chemicals that are used in food contact applications. But they have a structured database that is organized, and you can predict the toxicity of an unknown substance if you know its structure and its makeup. So the tools are there, and so even if FDA hasn't seen the compound before, they can prioritize the toxicity of the substance, and going forward with it. There's a wealth of information in FDA on the food side dating back to 1958.
And for both of you, again, just what has a lifetime of reviewing science, being a scientist, what has it taught you about food and health that you just want to share with others, that you feel that, if you worked at FDA, you would know this, but since you don't, here, let me share it with you now. Maybe Dennis, let me start with you.
Ooh. It for me, it goes back to what my mother would tell me when I was younger, which was to eat a balanced diet, eat your vegetables, don't eat the same thing every day. A piece of candy is okay, but in moderation. That is the key to longevity and health. In terms of the safety of food, I would encourage people to look at and focus on microbial contaminations and food processing and their fruits and vegetables, and making sure they are washed and clean and handled properly, because that's where most of the adverse effects happen, and some of them are very acute and can be quite deadly.
Bob?
Actually, I think what I learned was actually about a bunch of different things, that I did have an appreciation for food safety and that people should eat varied diets. Some of the things that I learned was I learned a lot more about agriculture working in the plant biotech area, and I learned about how hard it is to be a farmer, and some of the things that farmers have to go through, that the pests are constantly changing and evolving, and they have more and more trouble with weeds and 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 so particularly for the small farmer, it's a real challenge. That and I don't think most people really appreciate where their food comes from. And I think as much as anything, one of the things that I learned to do was appreciate where food comes from. You know, we are so used to, those of us that are urbanites or even suburbanites, walking into a grocery store and seeing all of these fruits and vegetables that look identical in the grocery store. And you know, that if you've tried growing your own things, that's not really how they they tend to work. That there's a lot of waste in the food arena, and that there are a limited number of things that you end up seeing, because those are the things that the marketing people think are going to sell, and sometimes they're not the most nutritious options. So I've learned a lot about a lot of different things from doing my job.
Well, Doctors Dennis Keefe and Robert Merker, I am thrilled that you've come on Food Truths today, and those listening today have come on to take a listen to just a small smidgen of the expertise and history and knowledge these two have about the food safety and just the food innovation that has occurred in the United States over the last 30 years. And I want to thank you guys again for being here and being on the show.
Thank you, Eric, and good luck with the podcast.
You can catch Food Truths as well wherever you listen to podcasts and here on the Spoon Podcast Network. Until next time, thanks again for listening.